In 1997, I entered a want ad that said, "Do you like running around on ships talking to sailors? Apply Navy Times." And so I came down here for an interview and pulled off Edsel, and bam, got stuck behind the train. So I was a couple of minutes late to the interview, but luckily Tobias, who was the editor of Navy Times at the time, still hired me. And so I've spent a not entirely trivial portion of the past 17 years waiting for this train. And eventually, it occurred to me to wonder, what is that train doing there? I mean, not that particular train. It's pretty easy to ascertain that the trains that we all get stuck behind are hauling hopper cars full of gravel to the Vulcan Materials plant to be turned into ready-mix concrete. But the broader question of why we have a railroad at all along the southern boundary of our lovely industrial park really captivated me. And so I looked into it and I found out that we are far from the angriest people about this train. Here you can see 395 and the Beltway, and that's us at GGM, and the red star is where we all get stuck. And you can see that our favorite stretch of track is actually a stub that goes along this big main line. And if we zoom out, we can see that this main line is actually one of the most important stretches of track in the eastern United States. It's owned by Norfolk Southern, and it runs up and down the Atlantic seaboard. So, how did it get to be here? And who are these angry people anyway? The story begins 170 years ago. In the 1840s, there were merchants of Alexandria who were looking for a way to make their port competitive with Baltimore and Richmond. And so they envisioned a railroad that would bring the products of Virginia's heartland to the Potomac River so they'd be shipped out to the world. Now, railroads were less than 20 years old at this point, so they were rickety and unreliable, and yet these merchants managed to convince the Virginia General Assembly to sanction a rail line from Alexandria, 90 miles west, to Orange County, Virginia. And they called it the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. One of the directors of this railroad, a Mr. Henry Dangerfield, bought 900 acres of land, beginning right here, stretching south past the rail line and encompassing the Hechinger Strip Mall. And there were natural springs on the property, so he called it Springfield. And he managed to convince the railroad to build its first station west of Alexandria at Springfield. And then he managed to convince the U.S. Post Office to make Springfield its first, the first post office for the new town. It's still a working station, and now it serves the VRE. So Mr. Dangerfield made a lot of money on this little plot of land in the railroad, and frankly, so did other people, because this railroad was the first from the nation's capital region southward. And when it was completed in 1854, it, for the first time, allowed somebody to get on a train in New England and travel pretty much continuously by rail all the way down to the south. It's a good deal for basically everybody except the more than 500 slaves who were forced to help build it. Not unrelatedly, 6 years after it was completed, the Civil War broke out. The Civil War was the world's first railroad war. Troops, materiel moved by train faster than they ever had before. And so the O&A, by virtue of this connection to the Confederate capital of Richmond, was like a dagger pointed at the heart of the Confederacy. And so our stretch of track here, heading west, became the most fought over right-of-way in the war. In July 1861, a Confederate force marched on the Orange and Alexandria's junction at Manassas, and thus was joined the first big battle of the war. This was, of course, the first Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. And this was the one where everybody famously came out from Washington with a picnic blanket because they expected the Federals to whip the rebels, and everybody would go home happy. And of course, that's not the way it worked out. There were many more years of fighting. For example, later in the year, a detachment of Confederate troops actually took our Springfield station. And it took 2 months for the Union to chase them away. The next year, 1862, the Confederates attacked the O&A junction at Manassas again, giving us the second Battle of Bull Run. And the year after that, they staged another raid on our Springfield station, and so on and so forth. And so Union and Confederate fought over our strip of railway for 3 years, alternately destroying it and rebuilding it, bridges, platforms, tracks, infrastructure. The Orange and Alexandria Railroad itself barely survived the year. Infrastructure was pummeled, its rolling stock was destroyed, but ultimately it was saved, as so many other railroads were, by merging with the former competitor, which was then purchased by another railroad, which was then purchased by another railroad, which was then purchased by another railroad. And that brought us into the 20th century, the heyday of American railroading, when our little stretch was owned by the Southern Railway. Southern Railway operated one of the most famous passenger liners of the glamour days of railroading, the Crescent Limited, an all-Pullman luxury express that whisked passengers from New York City via Springfield to New Orleans in under 34 hours. This route is still run by Amtrak today. You can still ride the Crescent Limited, and it still goes right past us. In 1982, the Southern joined up with the Norfolk and Western, giving us today's Norfolk Southern. Fourth largest railroad by revenue, second largest by track in the United States. So if any of this talk of the O&A has piqued your interest, you may be interested to know that you can still find traces of that old railway. Old Town Alexandria recently rehabbed this tunnel, added support and lighting. And so if you're inclined, you can go downtown and walk 170 feet under the streets of Alexandria and pop out near the riverfront. So, what have we learned? We've learned that this very ground on which we work is the old farm that gave its name to the city of Springfield. We've learned that we have a very close and very real tie to 170 years of history. And I think we've also learned that even if the train frustrates us or makes us angry, at least we are not living in a war zone because of it.